Do you do push-ups when you work out? What about a barbell bench press? What about a chest press with dumbbells? Why do you do each of these? Because you're being told, or because you are making a very strategic and conscious decision about what each of these offers for your body? Today on the Exercise is Health podcast, Julie and I discuss this topic of push-ups, barbell bench press, and dumbbell chest press, some of the differences between each, and why you may choose to use one over another when you are wanting to build your upper body strength and upper body muscle. We're going to cue the intro song, and then we're going to dive right into this conversation. Welcome to the Exercise is Health podcast, where we're talking about exercise, health, and the interconnectedness of the two. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we will be coming to you every single week from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Exercise is Health podcast. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we're coming to you from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg, here in Schaumburg, Illinois. Now, at Muscle Activation Schaumburg, we believe your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards improving the health and function of your muscles. And today, we want to talk to you about an exercise that, well, actually, it's a couple exercises that are very common in the fitness world and are often used interchangeably with one another. And we want to discuss why actually they may not be as interchangeable as we often think, and what these differences are that make them maybe less interchangeable than we on the surface level think they should be.
Today we're going to be talking about the differences between a push-up, a bench press, and a dumbbell press. Now, a lot of times when we think about these exercises, we think about, oh, they're all working your chest or your pec muscles, and they're all just variations of the same exercise, just different tools. So, we should do them all. But as you guys know, if you've listened to our podcast, there are pros and cons, appropriateness and lack of appropriateness that would be applied to each and every one. And today we're going to be talking about the intricacies of each. Now, before you dive into the content of this message, I want to make sure you guys understand that Charlie nor I are saying that either one is superior or inferior. We're just talking about what each one provides and the limitations of each one, because there are limitations and benefits to every single exercise. And the more that we can understand these, the more that we can better make choices about our exercise to better benefit our health.
For sure. So there are definitely some mechanical differences between them. Even though they might be all classified as like a chest exercise, there are mechanical differences which actually allow you to target the chest muscles, your pecs, to a different degree. So that's a big thing to consider. There's also a stability difference and a support difference between the exercises, both for the trunk and for the hands. And I think the latter is something that often is not considered. We often think, okay, when I'm doing a push-up, I can see like my trunk is moving in space. But when you are doing a push-up and your hands are relatively fixed to the ground, that's a big thing. As well as when you're doing a bench press with a barbell, your hands are relatively fixed to that barbell, which is a big thing. But that isn't the case for when you are doing a chest press using dumbbells. So that's another thing that we need to discuss as well.
Definitely. So we are going to be taking probably the deepest dive into the mechanics of these exercises, because that's what Charlie and I look at all the time. So this will definitely pertain to how muscles are being targeted, the specificity of the target of these muscles. And then additionally, if you're having any joint issues when you're doing any of these exercises, this would be a great podcast. The last thing that I want to bring up before we get into the juicy stuff is, if you can't do a push-up and you're listening to this and you're rolling your eyes because you can't do a push-up, you're like, dang, everyone likes to talk about push-ups. Don't worry. I stink at push-ups too, and your ability and the quality of push-up that you can do doesn't represent the amount of health that you can get from your general exercise. So I just want to put that out there, because push-ups are like touted as the number one, or one of the number one exercises, along with squats and crunches, that should be, in your fitness routine. But hopefully, again, after you listen to this podcast, you can better understand, obviously, the pros and cons of each one and what each one provides, etc. So one thing I want to start with is, when we exercise, and you know this, but it may not have ever been said directly to you, but when you exercise, there are parts of exercises where your body is moving and parts of your body that are not moving. And sometimes we're responsible for moving the part that's moving. For example, if your arms are moving in an exercise, we're trying to actually move our arms. But there are also parts of an exercise where your body's not moving. And this is the place where I want to start, because some exercises you're responsible for keeping that part still. And in some other exercises, you have something going on, whether it's like a bench or a support or a bar, that makes it so that you're a little bit less responsible for having to keep it not moving. So when you think about an exercise, there is part of your body that's moving and part of your body that's not moving, both of which have to be maintained to keep proper form. For example, like in a push-up, you would think, oh, my arms are going to move, but my butt shouldn't be moving, my knees shouldn't be moving. That's what I'm talking about, which, of course, again, you know that, but it may not have ever been said directly to you. Or, for example, if you're doing a dumbbell press, which is another exercise we're talking about today, you're like, oh yeah, my arms should be moving. I should see the dumbbells going up and down, but I shouldn't be, flailing my legs around. Like, I should keep those still, right? They should not be moving. Or in a bench press, the same thing. Your arms are moving up and down, which, again, we're going to be responsible for. But your torso should be stable, or it'd be kind of weird to see someone like flopping like a fish on the bench while they're trying to do a dumbbell press. So long story short, when you exercise in general, there are parts that you have to move and there are parts that shouldn't be moving. And the first piece that I want to kind of dissect here between the three, and there are pros and cons and, limits and benefits to the non-moving part and what you're doing to achieve the non-moving part.
So why this is so important is because the more you have to actively control the non-moving aspect, that means the more you have to focus on controlling the non-moving aspect of the exercise or of your body while you're doing the exercise, which means you have less focus to put towards doing the moving part of the exercise. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes there may be very strategic reasons why you want to put the majority of your focus on, say, like controlling where your trunk is while you're doing a push-up. But more times than not, when somebody does a push-up, they're not as focused on what their trunk is doing, and they're more focused on their chest and their shoulders. Their goal is to challenge their chest muscles. Their goal is to challenge their shoulder muscles. But the fact remains that because they're still having to actively manage the position of their trunk, that means they can't fully focus on their chest and their shoulders. They still have to put some of that focus on maintaining their trunk position. Now, this is different than doing a barbell bench press or doing a dumbbell chest press, where the position of your trunk is supported by the bench, which then now all of a sudden dramatically decreases your requirement to need to focus on maintaining actively the position of your trunk, and you instead get to put more focus on challenging and squeezing your chest muscles and your shoulder muscles. So while this may not seem like that big of a deal, actually, when it comes to the execution of the exercise, it becomes a really big deal depending on what your goal is from the exercise. If you're doing the exercise for your chest and your shoulder muscles, well, it may make sense to do an exercise where that's all you have to focus on. You don't have to focus on a bunch of other stuff.
That's right. And actually, I was just thinking of a story that is totally in line with what you just said, Charlie. But do you remember when we were on the COVID stay-at-home order, Charlie and I did 75 days straight of home workout. Home workouts means that we don't have the machines, we don't have the barbells, and we didn't really have heavy dumbbells. So anyways, we did this exercise that completely stressed out my hip flexors. And I remember being like, dang, I wasn't expecting my body to respond that way. My hip flexors are pretty sore and achy now. And I remember the following day we had a workout that included push-ups. Okay. And so again, push-ups aren't bad. We do them. But as Charlie said, they do include you needing to actively manage the rest of your body because you don't have support there. So while we're working chest, I'm trying to keep my core and my hips and my knees and my ankles and my feet all stable and not moving, while I'm also trying to focus and challenge my chest muscles. And I remember thinking, wow, this is the most distracted I've ever felt trying to work my chest because my hip flexors are having an issue today. We see this all the time where maybe you have a low back thing or you have a core thing or a hip thing like I was having, and maybe it's orthopedic in nature, meaning you have something going on like you have a hip issue in the joint, or maybe it's like temporary thing like I had going on. I had just overworked it. It was sore and achy. Either way, you're having to, my brain and your brain have to actively manage that piece while you're also trying to say, hey, I want to stimulate my pecs and chest to get the, appropriate stimulus. It's just what the exercise is. It's like involved. It's all involved. So on that day, a smarter choice for me probably would have been to just eliminate that piece. Julie, let those hip flexors rest. You overdid it. Why don't you, lay on your back, use this bench, which by the way, I didn't have available to me, but I could have used the floor, and do a dumbbell press or a barbell press. So that's an example of when it might have been a better decision to use one over the other. Now, some people are really, really into total body inclusion type exercises. So if you're really into that, or you really feel biased or drawn to that, or your body just feels amazing when you do all those exercises that don't include benches and machines and things like that, you might really bias a push-up. You might think, oh, this is great. I actually like working my chest and also having to squeeze everything else in my body. That's what I'm actually going for. That's my goal. So great. Then a push-up would be more advantageous for your goal for that day.
Along those same lines, another thing that needs to be considered from an active management standpoint when you're doing a push-up is the position of your shoulder blade. Now, the position of your shoulder blade also needs to be considered when you're doing a barbell bench press or a dumbbell chest press, but the reason why I'm singling out the push-up is because a lot of times the shoulder blades have a lot more movement that happens during the push-up motion, specifically when you are actually like pushing up. A lot of people will allow their shoulder blades to what's called protract or come forward, and then when you're lowering yourself back down towards the ground, then people will allow their shoulder blades to retract or come backwards. So there's this kind of forward and backwards motion that often happens with your shoulder blades during a push-up. Compare that to you doing a barbell bench press or a dumbbell chest press, and more times than not, it is actually cued or instructed to almost kind of keep the shoulders back while you're doing that exercise. Keep the shoulders in a more retracted position while you're doing that. And there are very strategic and mechanical reasons why that can be a really good cue, why that can be a really good thing. But the difference with that is when you're doing a push-up, you may not be thinking as much about, okay, what's my shoulder blade doing while you're doing the push-up. When you're doing the bench press and when you're doing the dumbbell chest press, now all of a sudden, you don't necessarily have to think about your trunk position, but now all of a sudden you may have to think about your shoulder blade position and really trying to keep those shoulder blades back, and some people say like pinched together. So there's, again, a trade-off there where, yes, you have the support of the bench for your torso and your hips, but you are also more likely to maybe have to now actively manage the position of your shoulder blade, whereas when you do a push-up, the shoulder blade motion is not considered as much because it just kind of comes along for the ride, and a lot of people will allow the protraction and retraction to take place.
Right. And this is definitely a topic that Charlie and I dive into with clients, especially if you're having shoulder issues and you're here to explore, like, how can I achieve being able to tolerate this exercise without pain or pinching or feeling crazy the next day or funky the next day. So definitely the shoulder blade position totally plays a part into how your muscles are firing, how short and long you can get muscles. And additionally, I think a huge piece that Charlie brought up, which is your ability to focus and be able to actively manage this shoulder blade piece, which you may or may not have been even aware that that is something to think about. The next thing I want to talk about, which is also about moving and non-moving parts, but it's not going to be the way that I just presented it before. This is going to be restraints of an exercise that creates the ability to move or not move. Let me paint the picture first so you know what I'm talking about, and then we're going to talk about the ins and outs of this. When you do a push-up, do you notice how your hands are stuck to the ground? Like you go up and down, but your hands never really moved, right? Or if you could imagine, if you're not familiar with the exercise, you're laying on your back, you're doing a barbell press. You're not sliding your hands in and out. They're staying right where you gripped in the beginning. But then there's the dumbbell press where you're holding on to 2 free weights. And so obviously your hands can move in and out. So on this specific topic, the specific piece that goes along with this pressing exercise would be like the in and outness that your hands get to do or not get to do. And what does that mean for you? Now, the first place that I want to talk about this is the dumbbell press, because that's the place where we get to move it in and out. And that one is going to be unique relative to the other two. When we have a press with dumbbells, we have the freedom to take the arms out to the side at that lower down position, and then you press up, which you could keep them wide, you could keep them narrow, you could keep them somewhere in between. At the very top, some people bang them together. So there's all these variations that happen, and we could talk about the pros and cons of those. But again, what we're trying to do today is compare, well, what does that mean for you and your shoulders and stimulating your pecs and blah, 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 relative to when you don't have that freedom of going in and out, which you don't have that freedom when you're doing a push-up or a dumbbell press just because of the restraints of the exercise.
Yeah, so what's really cool about this is if for whatever reason your shoulders are bothering you or whatnot when you do a push-up or when you do a bench press, if you have access to dumbbells, because the dumbbells allow more, say, like freedom of motion, like Julie was describing, that allows more opportunity to use different what are called paths of motion when you're doing the exercise. For example, you can do a dumbbell press with your elbows tucked in by your sides, or you can have your elbows all the way flared out up by your shoulder level, okay? Anywhere in between are all viable options, and they're all potential options that you could utilize if the traditional push-up position or the traditional, especially with the barbell, because push-ups you can kind of change your hand position as well, not so much while you're doing the exercise, but definitely at the start of the exercise you can decide to have your elbows in more, have your elbows flared out more. But especially with the barbell, your hands are fixed relative to the path that they're moving through. With the ability to kind of change your hand position, with your ability to change your elbow position, that will allow for different forces and different stresses to be placed across your shoulders, which allows for a greater opportunity to find a version of the exercise that fits for your body.
Charlie, I think you really hit the nail on the head in the beginning where you said there's more freedom of motion with the dumbbells. Now, often when we hear, I don't know if we're like biased here in the United States with the word freedom or whatever, but I think that we automatically think, oh, that must be way better. That's good. But there are drawbacks to having this freedom of motion, and there are benefits. So again, the benefit is that you have more options of how you're going to move because of the lack of fixedness of the dumbbells. Now, with more freedom of motion, there is a higher skill requirement that is needed to execute this exercise with control and to do it while stimulating the correct muscles. This is something that we have to work a lot on with clients, is if we're going to be using dumbbells, because of the high level of freedom of motion, which again just is what it is, also requires now a high level of skill to achieve consistent form or a form that is appropriate for the body. So something that is beneficial when you don't have the freedom of motion, or you have more limited freedom of motion, is that you're having to manage less. You're not having to think about the north, south, east, west of each dumbbell. You're fixed to the ground or you're fixed to the dumbbell, and it's like, okay, push this thing forward and bring it back down, or lower my chest to the ground and push it back up. So there's beauty in both, and the beauty comes with different benefits, right? So one is, again, we're managing less, so I can focus more on just stimulating my pecs. You can probably lift more weight if you don't have dumbbells because you are not having to manage that freedom of motion. Or if you think the north, south, east, west piece, there's none of that wobble. But then the beautiful part about dumbbells is that you have that wobble. If you are able to control through that kind of freedom, then you're able to choose a path that might be more appropriate for your shoulder, that is maybe more difficult to achieve when there's that fixed piece of the push-up or barbell press.
Now, another benefit of having your hands more fixed during the push-up and during the barbell bench press is you can play with different things, such as instead of just thinking about pushing straight into the ground or pushing the barbell straight up to the ceiling, because your hands are more fixed, you also have the opportunity to pull in a little bit, pull out a little bit, which also changes the challenge for your muscles and changes the stresses on your joints. This is actually one of the biggest things that can come into play, especially if you're having shoulder issues, when it comes to figuring out how to do these exercises in a way that matches your body, in a way that is building of your body and not breaking your body down, is playing with this pushing your hands together or pulling your hands apart while you're doing the exercise. This is a really big piece. It doesn't sound like it would be much, but I'm telling you, for a lot of people, this is a make it or break it kind of thing.
Charlie, and as you said, this is exclusive to when your hands are fixed, pulling in and out, because we're trying to create like a friction force rather than a movement. So if you imagine if you had all that freedom of motion that we talked about with the dumbbells, you can't push in or pull out without the dumbbells flinging in and out, which is not what you're wanting the exercise to be. So again, that is what, as Charlie said, one of the benefits of having that fixed piece of your hands, and one of the limitations of having all the freedom with the dumbbells. The last thing we wanted to bring up, which is really good for someone like me, because as you guys know, I said in the beginning, I'm not very good at push-ups. And the reason I'm not very good at push-ups is because you have a fixed weight that you have to do a push-up with, and that weight is your body. And that can be a cool thing, and that can be a negative thing. But have you ever noticed at the gym, you always are picking your weights? You're like, okay, for bicep curls, I'm going to do 10 pounds. For chest, I'm going to do 20 pounds. For triceps, I do 8 pounds. Well, that's like your hands selecting how much weight you're wanting to use for each body part. A push-up, and also many other body weight exercises, already has the weight selected for you, and that is whatever your body is presenting in that orientation relative to gravity. So you don't really get to choose the weight that you do with a push-up unless you decide to, manipulate the exercise to a greater extent, like using a band or putting some weights on your back, which would be very awkward. But anyways, you have a fixed weight with a push-up, which is, it just is what it is. It can be really great, meaning like you've mastered the weight of your body given that orientation, or it can be very difficult because maybe you're like, dang, well, I'd love to do push-ups, but every time I do push-ups, I do 1 and I'm crazy sore, or I do 3 and I'm crazy sore. Like the weight is just way too much for the tolerance of your muscles. Now, the benefit that we get from the barbell and the dumbbells is that there is more variation in weight, meaning that we get to work and stimulate and bring on health benefits to your pecs even when you can't tolerate the amount of weight of your body. Additionally, we get to challenge and stimulate and bring about health benefits to these muscles when the tolerance of your muscles is way higher than what a push-up could present. So think about like someone that's super duper strong, and to get the maximum health benefits from your muscles, you have to be stimulating them to a large amount. Well, the limit there is their body weight. So what if they're way stronger than what their body weight can present?
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to, making push-ups more challenging, sure, you can, add weighted vests or, use bands or things like that. But as Julie said, that can get a little bit awkward, especially when compared to the ease of use of just saying adding more weight to a barbell or grabbing some heavier dumbbells. That being said, the convenience of that is certainly unique to a push-up, where you don't have to have 45-pound plates or however much, to add onto a barbell. You don't have to have dumbbells that go up to 100 pounds or however heavy you would want for your dumbbells for your chest press. But another thing that people do a lot is they will change their body orientation while they're doing a push-up. Say, they'll go from having their hands, say, on a step or their hands elevated to their hands flat to the ground, to then doing it with their feet elevated. And they'll notice, differing challenges at each of those. And I think the thing to recognize with that is, yes, it's a different challenge, but it's a different challenge in part because of the number of muscles that you're able to utilize with each of those, as well as the relative bias of the muscles that you're able to use while you're doing each of those. Meaning, like, the more your feet are elevated relative to your hands, the more you're going to be using muscles like your shoulders and, maybe like your upper pecs, which are called the clavicular fibers of your pec major. Versus if your hands are elevated relative to your feet, then you're going to involve more of your pec muscles as well as your shoulder muscles. So yes, there is a differing challenge there, but it's also a different focus, a different bias with the muscles that are being used.
So that is definitely something to consider when you're doing a push-up. Just the fact that this is body weight exercise, so the kind of the fixed weight is your body. And as Charlie brought up, one way that people like to manipulate, which you can decide to participate in or not, is to change the orientation of your body. Now, one of the limitations or things to consider when we're thinking about, so there's more weight variation when we go to the bar or we go to the dumbbell. So with the bar, I learned this a very interesting way. When I was in college, I remember I started doing barbell presses, which I just saw someone do it and I thought, I'm just going to try that. And I remember putting on, maybe 5s on each end and realizing that 5s was a lot. And I couldn't even imagine how this was so much, because 5 on one side and 5 on the other side in my head led to 10. But I didn't realize that the bar was heavy. Like, the bar had weight. Bar was like 35 or 45 pounds. What's the standard weight of the bars?
45.
45 pounds. So really, I had loaded up 55 pounds on this bar that I didn't realize was going to be so heavy. It's something to consider if you're thinking about doing the bar presses, is that bar has weight, meaning there is a starting low level, right? So again, if you have really deconditioned pecs, or you're not used to doing chest exercises, or it's a brand new exercise, just know that, hey, this has a bottom limit unless you can find something else that's really super duper light, that's not the standard bar that goes with those benches. Now, the dumbbells have a complete variation. You could lay on your back and dumbbell press with your fists. Maybe that's a great place to start. Or with 1s, 2s, 3s. There's a lot more variety of the weights that you can do with that dumbbell press. So when you're thinking about the weight that's provided or the resistance that's provided with each of these exercises, just know that there is, yes, one is restricted by how much your body weighs. And the next one, there is a low level with the bar, meaning the bar has some weight. So you can't go to 5 pounds with a bar unless you can find a 5-pound bar, which is not the standard weight of what you would normally find at a gym. And then with the dumbbells, again, you have that full spectrum of dumbbells that you can be using for the dumbbell press.
So each of these exercises has pros and cons to it. Yes, you can look at them each as exercises that can challenge your chest muscles, that can challenge your shoulder muscles, that you can use to build upper body muscle and upper body strength. But understanding the ins and outs of them and some of the details that Julie and I talked about will help lead you to make better decisions for your body on a given day as far as how you want to go about challenging your chest muscles, challenging your upper body muscles, and building your strength. While all these tools can accomplish that, based on how your shoulders are doing, based on, how the rest of your body is doing, like Julie talked about her hip flexors, you can make decisions that are better built for your body, which will allow you ultimately not only to get better results from your exercise, but continue to come back to your exercise on a regular basis with fewer issues over the long term. So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know who often interchanges push-ups, dumbbell bench press, and barbell bench press, or who only does one and doesn't do any variation? Send this episode to them so they can learn about why they may want to strategically choose doing one versus the other, or why they might want to start adding in in a little bit more variety to how they are challenging their chest muscles. And while you're online, if you wouldn't mind, head on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find this podcast when they're looking for information on exercise and they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us a 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week. Hey there, it's Charlie again. One last thing. I want to let you in on a secret project that I've been working on for quite some time now. I am planning on releasing a book by the middle of summer 2021. But here's the thing, because I'm self-publishing this book, there's only going to be a limited number of copies available at any given time. So to learn more about this book and to be one of the first to find out when this book actually gets released, what I need you to do is go to exerciseforlifemethod.com. There you'll find out more information as well as some exclusive bonuses that I'm offering just for simply staying in the loop with what's going on with this book. So to learn more and claim your bonuses, go to exerciseforlifemethod.com, enter in your information, and you'll be automatically kept up to date. Learn all about the book and bonuses at exerciseforlifemethod.com. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.